So sometimes no agenda is a really good agenda to have, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very misunderstood thing because people look at that, they read the book or they see all this and they go, oh my God, that's so structured, that's so engineered, that's so overly structured. Then they meet me or they meet our team or whatever, and they go, God, you're nothing like what we thought you'd be. They thought you'd be
Right.
you're gonna be a type A, button down, tight ass
You're
kind
not
of
making me
guy.
feel guilty for not closing more
But
tasks.
see, no, but see, I love that whole idea of spontaneity and being open to the serendipity of the universe. To me, is where a lot of the cool stuff shows up. That's why I came up with GTD and why it's so powerful. It gives me the ability to do that and stay that way.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them.
David Allen is one of the world's most influential thinkers on productivity and a massive influence on myself and many of my friends around the world. His 35-year experience as a management consultant and executive coach have earned him worldwide recognition, and his best-selling book, the groundbreaking Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity, has sold millions of copies and been published in 30 languages. The GTD methodology it describes has become a global phenomenon, being taught by training companies in more than 90 countries. In this conversation, we discuss David's journey from a kid who liked to perform elaborate magic tricks to a spiritual seeker in the 60s at Berkeley, to one of the world's most influential thinkers on personal and business productivity. We also discuss how GTD was designed and created, what can be termed the more spiritual aspects of GTD, some misunderstood aspects of his message, and many other topics in productivity and life. As I told David, I read his books very early on in my career, and they've helped me stay on top of my very first adult job and have been part of my toolkit ever since. It's really quite impossible to separate my success in my career from the fact that I could always stay on top of work projects without falling apart or stressing out too much. If you find yourself overwhelmed by all of your commitments, I think you might find this conversation and David's work in general very valuable. And if you are a fan of GTD, like so many millions of others, I think you'll find some unexplored topics here and perhaps some extra motivation to get back on the GTD horse. So let's jump right in with David Allen. All right. I'm sitting here across the screen from David Allen. David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for the invitation.
And so the first question these days is always, how are you doing with COVID? And what's the situation where you are? And I know you've been living in the Netherlands for a while.
Yeah. Well, it's in a pretty tight lockdown, though with my lifestyle, it hasn't made a huge amount of difference other than my hair is starting to look like I looked in Berkeley in 1971.
Nice. It's a good look.
My barber can't open up yet, but otherwise, my wife and I that run our businesses and the work that we do that virtually, we've done that for years anyway. So that's not a big deal. And the Netherlands is pretty cooperative, and so food markets and wine stores and all that stuff for the critical stuff is still available. Yeah. So it's not too hard on me. Obviously, for people in the hospitality trades, it's a nightmare. And especially in a place like the Netherlands, which is, of course, it's a terrible place, dirty, unsafe. Everybody stay away. You never want to come.
You're trying to keep the Americans out. That's funny.
No, it's all right. It's all right. But it is refreshing, actually, to have no tourists in Amsterdam because it's such a beautiful place.
Yeah, I love Amsterdam. I was there as a kid a couple of times. My mother is actually Dutch, but I haven't been since. So it's an interesting.
So did you inherit the Dutch directness? And
I didn't need the Dutch directness because I'm also Israeli, which is the other.
Oh my God!
Yeah.
You've got exponential directness. Yeah, no
exactly.
Kidding.
Whenever I meet a Dutch person, it feels like a natural fit. And is that one of the reasons you moved there, or
no? It's one of the reasons.
You're a pretty direct guy. Okay.
No, I love approval too much. I'm not that direct. My wife is much more direct than I am. So she's the executive of our work. I let her do that. I try to be the
Interesting.
nice guy because
Interesting.
I'm more wired that way. But anyway, it's actually lovely. It's great. The Dutch are so practical. Things work. Things are direct, and they're very elegant. They're very polite and very
Yeah.
very correct in terms of how they engage with people. And as they've got 600 years of deep engagement in
Mm.
business and history, we love the culture. We love the people. That's great.
Yeah. It's also a very design centric culture, which I love
Boy,
every time I'm there.
we just passed. We're walking back from, or walking to pick up our bikes. Or we don't have cars. We just have bikes, and they were getting serviced. We were walking by, and there was this great little shop actually next to a cleaners that had these aluminum cans, beer cans or Coke cans or whatever, these little cans, and they were crushed and were made into art. And they had
Mm.
their open thing. There was open mouth, and somebody had done these incredible things. I said, "That's so Dutch. It's just
Mm.
so quirky, fun, artistic." So their
Yeah.
design sense is really huge. We know Marcel Wanders, and we've always loved that. Dutch gardens,
Mm.
elegant, quirky, and their design sense, indeed.
Yeah. I love that stuff. I should write myself a to do, a next action to look into when I can travel there. So has GTD been affected? You said you're mostly set up to work remotely. Have you seen any effects on how people should do GTD? How is it affected by COVID?
Sure, sure. It just increased exponentially the need to do GTD.
Hmm.
GTD shows up in change and in challenging situations you didn't expect. That's why I always tie it to a lot of martial arts metaphors. But your ability to deal with surprise is your ability to be relaxed and your ability to be clear.
Hmm.
So if you got a whole lot of backlog of unclarified, unprocessed, uncaptured, unorganized stuff, any new input's going to be a bitch
Hmm.
because you don't know what you're missing. You don't know what you're not doing. You don't know how much attention you should put to that new thing.
Yeah.
So that's why when I'm not doing anything else, I'm cleaning up backlog to zero because I know there's something coming toward me I can't see. And when that
Yeah.
hits, clear space is the most appropriate, productive, with it place to operate from. So you're not over or under reacting. That's why I used Bruce Lee Sensei's metaphor of mind like water. That's why I use that in describing a lot of what this is about, so
Hmm.
that you get a clear enough head so you don't over or under react to input.
Cool.
And you're
Yeah.
also then can sit on top of what you need to do instead of play victim to it.
Yeah. And we'll touch on that. Do you feel like, I feel like contexts have been shrinking. Like there's only one context almost these days. Like it's all like at home. And yes, you have your computer there, but it's really, you almost have to make it up.
No,
Almost
you're
have to
right.
decide randomly. So, was there any new recommendations for this time or any kind of chatter
No,
around?
no. There's a lot of chatter around it, but there's no from the methodology standpoint. It's all the same thing. Called what do you need to do to keep your head empty, and how do you need to organize reminders so that you need as little energy as possible to be reminded of the right stuff at the right time.
Hmm.
That will be true when we fly to Jupiter in 2090.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing new about the methodology. But
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of the older suggestions pre-pandemic were, yeah, there's probably, if you have 100 next actions, probably best to organize them in some sort of a context, like errands to run, stuff to talk to your life partner about, things you need to do at the computer, websites you need to surf. So yeah, organizing your reminders wherever you do. But come on, anybody listening to this who keeps a calendar or keeps a post-it on their fridge for groceries to buy is already doing that.
Yeah, that's right. So, we'll dive more into the history of GTD, but I'd like to start early in life and see if we can find interesting patterns. And so, my first question is usually, what's something you learned early in life, in childhood, that is still with you today, that still drives you today?
Well, it's only in retrospect. I certainly wasn't aware of it when it was happening. But my
Hmm.
first job was being a magician on the sidewalk in Palestine, Texas, at age 5 or age 6, where I had come up with some magic tricks and charged 5 cents to do my magic trick. So if you think back, well, why? Come on, if you're talking to systems people, there's nothing more dynamic than a magician in terms of systems. The systems that
Hmm.
are set up to produce some transformational event You don't see the system that happened behind it, but if you didn't have the system, you couldn't make that work, right?
Interesting.
So
So it's
in
the
retrospect, I go, yeah,
invisible structure behind something magical.
indeed,
Interesting.
but invisible, but not while you're doing it. It's a very conscious exercise. Learn the
Right.
magic trick. Make sure that this is set up this way. Make sure this is set up that way. Practice it so you don't fumble. Practice it so that you can keep their attention while you're talking and they're not looking at what your hands are doing. So there's a whole lot of systematic process to being a magician. That
Yeah.
stayed as a job up through my teenage years. I bought magic tricks and did magic shows for kids' birthday parties and things like that.
That's
And so I
awesome.
guess in a way, you could just graduate that forward to what I'm doing now. It's all look behind here. And then, wow, suddenly I have a
Yeah.
clear head. Suddenly, whatever. So it was a systematic process. So I've always been fascinated by models and systemic things that you didn't have to change yourself a lot. All you had to do was work the system. But come on,
That's
all the whether it's Scrum or Agile or Kanban or all the way back to who's the guy that who went to Japan and then became famous for creating uh, sort of quality control, and best practice about all that stuff. So it all that stuff was like you don't have to change people. If they got a funky system, your best people are going to create funky results,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
It's the
if you
idea
got
of
a
the
funky
methodology
design,
almost.
I don't
Yeah.
I don't care how good you are. That's why there were certain design things that happened. Since I think you told me we're talking to a lot of designers and people that have that context.
Yeah.
Windows 3, I forget where that came out, changed the world for me because I was able to see Excel and spreadsheet at the same time and flip right from there to Word or whatever.
Yeah.
So
Just in the
there have
90s,
been
some early
something
90s
like
maybe.
that. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
God, I
Yeah.
can't even remember.
I
That was
remember
like,
it. Yeah.
yeah. And so sometimes the change in the system makes a change, even in terms of technology. And the technology, people have often asked what's changed out there. And frankly, and maybe I'm just old and cranky, Aaron, but I only think that there are two phenomenal events that happened that changed how we think, how we work, how we play: the spreadsheet and the word processor. And the
Hmm.
spreadsheet, you could go back to relational database, you could go back to whatever, all of that aspect of things. 83%, I read somewhere, 80 something plus percent of businesses are run off Excel.
Hmm.
But in order to do what they're doing, you'd have to hire about 14 accountants to do it if you didn't have a spreadsheet. So
Yeah.
spreadsheets very much changed the game. They changed how we think about business, how we think about work, and the word processor. Are you old? You're probably not old enough to remember erase tape on a real typewriter. Where
No, I have. There's a famous picture of me as a 3-year-old using a typewriter,
do
and
you
so
remember
I
erase tape?
remember. I do remember
That
it.
little
Yes, I do.
that tape you had to put it if you hit the wrong key, you had to
Yeah.
then put the tape in, hit that wrong key again to
Again,
erase it,
exactly.
and then
Yeah.
type the right key again.
The definition of a
But
kludge.
yeah, but what happened was before the word processor, you had to be right before you wrote.
Yeah.
After the word processor, you could just write a crappy first draft, which is the best way to write a book, the best way to write anything, best way to
100%.
produce anything. But it gave us the freedom to do that because it matched more how your mind really thinks. It likes to have
Yeah.
an idea and then later on figure out what it means and
Yeah.
what to do with it.
And from a designer's
Yeah.
perspective, there's a moment in the life of word processors where they created non-modal word processors. Before that, you'd have to be in a typing mode and then in an erasing mode and then so it was so frictionful. And then some guy, I remember reading the history of this guy, said, no, I should be able to do whatever I want at any time. And he created the ability to select text and replace it, the ability to hit backspace. It created a lot of the concepts that now we take for granted. But it wasn't, before then, you would have to select a mode. It was very slow.
The guy who created Word created
Yeah.
WYSIWYG when he was at Xerox. Charles Simonyi, probably the best paid programmer nobody knows unless you're really in that world. And he created Word, he created Office, he created Excel when he was working with Bill at Microsoft. He's back at Microsoft now, by the way.
Genius.
And Charles, yeah, Charles, I know Charles because his company, when he left Microsoft, Intentional Software, they then worked with me for a couple of years to see if they could digitalize the getting things done process. Because
Cool.
talk about some of the smartest people on the planet, then attacking this thing, and it didn't work. That's why I gave up trying to be in the software game anymore in terms
Mm,
of what I was doing. And people keep banging on me, go, David, where's the GTD app? Where's the GTD app? I go, I wrote it in 1995. I made that available to the public, out there.
yeah.
All the it was proprietary information, but I just said, finally, because nobody did it, the technology, though it was there, the resources you had to do to really make it the way I would want it as a full GTD app,
Mm,
uh, just would take an investment that would require really deep pockets, and that would require a market and an audience that was interested. But people still keep shit in their head, so why would they
mm,
want to buy something like that? So
yeah.
both the technology and the market were just the limiters to us being able to do it.
Interesting.
That was out beyond what you asked about, but just thought you might be interested, especially you design
Yeah.
folks out there.
It's super interesting, and we get into software because now you're selling these guides for how to implement GTD on different apps, and I recently bought the one for OmniFocus 3, and it was super helpful, even though I've used OmniFocus for years, and so just didn't know all the features, and so I think I'd be really interested in getting us from the teen magician into the world of consulting. How did that happen? And then how did it go from there to GTD? What's that arc?
How long do we have?
Now you understand why we blocked a long block of time. But
Oh my God, it's such a long story. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I thought I was a good student, and I was a child actor in
mm,
Shreveport, Louisiana, pretty much where I grew up, and in the community theaters and local theaters and so forth. I did that, so I loved presenting in
huh,
that way. And then I became a champion debater. We had a champion debate team in Shreveport uh,
interesting.
in high school. So I learned to stand up and produce stuff, and also how to quickly frame context for things and talk about them, argue about them, and so forth. So all those were instrumental. And then I decided to take a risk and applied to be a year-long exchange student in high school with anywhere in the world. AFS, American Field Service, was still going actually, but it was a service that set up to find international families internationally that would be willing to take American kids for a year.
Mm,
Actually, usually they took them for a summer, but they then had opened it up for anybody willing to take them for a year. And so there were only 300 of us in the U.S. that did that. And I applied and got taken up. And I then got to spend a year living with a Swiss family in Zurich
thanks.
when I was 17, 18. And that was certainly a life enhancing, if not changing experience, just eye opening to be in a culture. And it wasn't an academic program. It was really more of a social program to live with a family. And then you just went to the school that the kids in the family went to their school. It turns out that the kids in the
Mm,
family that took me in were going to one of the top pre-university high schools in all of Europe, the Realgymnasium Zurich.
huh.
So I, so I wound up, going to school. I could walk out of school and walk down 3 blocks to Cafe Odeon, which is where Dadaism started. It's where Jung wrote. It's where, and I could walk 1 block into the Kunsthaus of Zurich and then sit in a room of Monet's water lilies and just stare at them,
Yeah.
and also order a beer at age 17. How cool was this? And the European experience certainly opened my eyes a lot and moved me more into thinking about liberal arts as opposed to, I was good at math. I was good at thinking. Of course, if you grew
Mm,
up in a somewhat provincial place like Shreveport, Louisiana, and you're smart, you either become a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor or something of the traditional kind of, okay, smart people do these kind of things.
mm,
Consultant, what was that? Who ever knew what that was? I thought I might want to be an actor. Of course, my mom says, David, come on, you have to have a real job before you can
mm,
do anything like that. Then again, I don't want to make this long story too long, but then I applied to college, and I had decided my brother had gone to Yale and flunked out because he was great at math and science, but he was really more of a jazz musician. And so I said, I don't think I want to go to a big university. So it turns out I got recruited by this college that had opened up the year before I was graduating high school, and they were looking for interesting, strange, unusual kids to populate this college because it was one of the first colleges in the early 1960s no grades, independent study, design your own thing, high paid, big faculty, small student body. This was New College of Sarasota, Florida. But
Hmm.
I was in the second graduating class of that. This is 1960, or 1968, I graduated. And independent study. So you had 2 or 3 independent study periods. And I actually got a BA in 3 years. It was an 11-month program. So you just stayed in college, but you had a lot of independent study time. You could take 2, 3, 4 weeks off as long as you got a faculty to so some project you had. And one of my projects was I wound up hitchhiking from Istanbul to Karachi in 1967.
That was the
All the way.
project. You could get graded.
Actually, the project was to do a history thing because I turned out being a history major while I was in there.
Nice. I'm a history major too. That's
I started out in
my BA.
philosophy. But the philosophers wound up proving their original hypothesis with their original hypothesis. That's kind of a circle jerk. But what was more interesting was that why they thought that way. And it turned out that my advisor became a very good friend, was the head of history there, and he was an intellectual historian and turned me on to the history of thought, not political or military history, but history of culture, history of thinking, history of philosophy, history of science, all that. He turned me on to Spengler's book, The Decline of the West. Was one of the first books that started to. They didn't use the word, and we didn't even use the word back then about cultural paradigms, but that was what it was about. Spengler's idea, quite Germanic, was every culture actually has its own life and its own Geist and its own whatever, and each one was unique. For instance, the Greeks had no concept of infinity. In other words, what were the paradigms that affected how people that you could see the order or the context within the art, the science, the architecture, the literature, the music within that time. You could see the same frameworks. Baroque was Baroque
same
in terms of architecture, in terms of the same mindset, essentially, that permeated the creation of that. That was fascinating to me. Again, back to models and how the model affected perception and performance and expression of everything. So that was something that really turned me on to all of that. Anyway, I was as a history major.
That is a big surprise to me, but we're similar in this way. I started a BA in philosophy, and then quickly realized that the one course that I liked was the history of ideas, and I changed into a BA in history. It's a fascinating way to become aware of different possibilities than our own, right? Like it's almost like our own culture is invisible to us unless we see other cultures, other times in history, and that almost reinforces thinking in models and systems.
Yeah, and aware of limitation. Of why you can't see outside that box because you're in the box. It's like the last thing a fish notices is water, right?
Yep. Yeah. The story about how's the water, what's water. It's I think there's a cartoon, a fish cartoon. So that's great. So you have all this varied intellectual background and cultural background. And so how do you get from there to I'm going to help people be more productive? What's the
could have
just
fooled
accident?
me?
Okay.
Almost by accident. I went for my history. I graduated and then got into graduate school, UC Berkeley, 1968. 68 in Berkeley, pretty heady time to be there.
Yeah.
And I was an American intellectual history major in Berkeley in 68. And that was fascinating itself. But then at a certain point, I went, wait a minute. Instead of studying people who seemed to be enlightened or some version thereof, I said, I want my own. And of course, the 60s and 70s were heady time to be in California and discover yourself. And so a lot of the self-improvement, grow yourself, the personal growth stuff was very alive and nascent and very active there. Everything from the Esalen folks to to LifeSpring to whatever. And so I became very interested and involved in who I was and had a few experiences that were quite phenomenal and transformational for me, just in internal experiences and on an exploration about who I was, what I was about. God, truth, and the universe were my aspirations at that time. So I was not very materially oriented, but I still had to pay the rent. And rice bowl and cave, which were options as I read about, was not my I preferred good wine and attractive ladies. So I said, okay, how do I somehow explore all of this stuff? And
Mm.
so went down a lot of paths, studied a lot of things, got a black belt in the martial arts and karate. And so a lot of that personal exploration then wound up running down some strange paths, and I ran off the rails for a while because I was experiencing things that nobody else seemed to understand. And because I was Mr. Nice Guy, I'd always played the game the way everybody wanted me to play the game. And then I suddenly found myself alone and out on my own about what I was discovering and uncovering, and nobody else seemed to be around me to getting it. So how to handle all that. And I didn't know how to handle the experiences that were happening internally inside of me. Now I'd call them spiritual experiences, but I'd use a small s in that, not religious, but more, wait a minute, there's stuff going on, and I'm getting information and experiences internally that are quite transformative, that are changing how I'm seeing the world, how I'm seeing people, and the truths that I'm becoming aware of. So I began to taste what it was like to get my own version of, enlightenment, if you wanted to call it that.
Mm.
And I kept going down that path, and then ran across a guy who seemed to be ahead of me on the same path I was on, but way ahead of me. And I said, let me hang out with him and see what I can learn from him. And I said, at some point, I'll then figure out what I learned from him, then go on to something else. Turned out that I never got to the end of what he knew. So I spent 50 years with a guy named John Roger as my spiritual coach about what those different levels of experience were that we all actually have, but you're not very conscious of if you're in a material world, but you're still there. So there's multiple levels in spirit, there's multiple levels of spirit, there's multiple levels of things you can actually tap. And you don't have to wait to die to find out what all that's about. I got involved in that game, but then my outer world slowed down a lot as my inner world picked up a lot, but I still had to pay the rent because they weren't paying people to go do that stuff.
Yeah.
At least not,
They still
not me
don't
anyway.
probably. Yeah.
They still don't probably. So but then I had friends who seemed to know what they wanted to do materially. And again, I was not very entrepreneurial or aspirational. I was just trying to pay the rent. But I looked around for good jobs, and I wasn't stupid. So I found friends of mine or people I knew in my network who were starting their own businesses or had small businesses that then needed help. And said, okay, let me see if I can help them out. So I wound up with, if you read my Wikipedia, 35 jobs by the time I was 35, and they weren't professions, they were just jobs. So I helped a friend run a gas station. I helped a friend manage a landscape company. I helped two friends start a restaurant in LA. So I became a good number two guy. I would just walk in and go, well, how much easier can we make this? Because I'd like to leave earlier and not have to work so hard. So I just look around it and then help them process improvement, they call it, right?
Yeah.
So I just helped them improve how they were doing what they were doing. And then they would improve, and then I got bored. So then I go, okay, time for something else. And then I get bored and then get another opportunity and then move to another of those kind of jobs. And then I discovered they pay people to do that. They call themselves a consultant. Oh, wow. Now I R1, couldn't spell it. So 1982, hung out my shingle, Allen Associates. I said, okay, let me see if I can just sell myself on a project by project basis to people that might think I'm smart enough to help them do something that they might need to do. And I really had no idea. I've never had any formal or traditional education in terms of business psychology or time management. All this was just street stuff. So I wound up then also being very interested in saying, okay, now that I'm a consultant, it would be really nice because I knew consultants that were Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey. I knew people in my network that were quite sophisticated in that world, the MBA world, and folks that do those grunt jobs until they might become partner and then do all the kinds of stuff. But smart folks, obviously. And so I said, well, what can I learn about all that? So I became hungry to find models that I could use if in case I walked in, somebody wanted my help. If it wasn't obvious how to help them, wouldn't it be nice to be able to pull a magic trick out of my bag and say, let's walk through these things and that will improve your condition, whatever that might be. And so I got very hungry for that. Had a great mentor I attributed to in my book, GTD, Dean Acheson. And Dean, I hung out with him for a couple of years. He'd been an executive consultant for 25 years, especially in organizational change. And he shared with me the models he had come up with, a couple of pieces of which then became core elements of what became GTD. First of all, get everything out of your head, decide the next action on any of that stuff.
Hmm.
And he had uncovered that because he found that if you didn't do that with an executive he was trying to work with, they just had a lot of old baggage and stuff spinning around in there that kept them from being really focused on the future. So
Interesting.
so he had uncovered a way to get people a lot more present so they could make organizational change. It turns out that when people got more present, that solved 90% of the issues to begin with. It's like, oh, I'd
That's
been
really
avoiding
interesting.
talk. I've been this thing that had my attention. I've been avoiding dealing with that and making a next action decision about that. And now this issue is handled, or now I'm back in control of it again, as opposed to we have to go through some major big thing. So
Yeah.
interestingly enough, I discovered that I used it first for myself to discover, wow, that's really cool. People have often asked, gee, David, were you in some crisis that then forced you to discover all this? No, my life was okay. I didn't have a huge aspirational stuff, but I was fine. I was not out of control. But I had Dean walk me through a little bit of his process, and I went, oh my God. And I saw what a change it made for me in terms of my
Hmm.
clarity, my focus, my freedom. I'm a freedom guy. Don't fence me in. I like the idea of being free to be doing whatever I feel like doing at any moment.
Hmm.
But I discovered that process, at least some of those core elements of that process, made me more able to do that.
Yeah.
And then that's where that was the beginning. This is 1982, 83, whatever. So I began to design something around that and then started to use some of those models with my clients. And it turned out that what worked for me worked for them too. You applied some of these techniques and practices, got your head clearer. You were able to see more about what was important to you. You had more space, internally and cognitively to be able to focus more on the things you thought you wanted to focus on as opposed to being distracted by a lot of stuff.
Hmm.
Produce same results. So that kind of became a core of what I was teaching and consulting about. And then the big guy in the big corporate world showed up and said, gee, David, we need that in our whole company, as an outcome. Can you take what you've done and design some sort of a training program around the practices that you've come up with? So I
Right.
did that, and it was quite successful. And we did a pilot program for 1,000 executives and managers, at Lockheed, 1983, 84 in Burbank, California. And it was highly successful. So in spite of myself, given the story you've
Hmm.
heard, I found
Yeah.
myself thrust into the corporate training world. And they were all quite hungry for that because this was the mid 80s. And then from then on, the mid to senior level professionals were the ones that were starting to get hit with the tsunami of email and change and a lot of stuff that was going on those
Yeah.
days, in those different industries. And so my stuff became pretty popular. And I just referral based. I never did any marketing of any of this, and finally wound up partnering with a couple of people and hiring some staff to help just manage the demand that was coming at us. A lot of my consulting turned into coaching for mid to senior level people in these organizations that wanted hands-on, desk side, hold their hand and have walk them through the process that they got introduced to in a seminar.
Hmm.
So that's a lot of. So I literally spent. Malcolm Gladwell talks about 10,000 hours. I probably spent 50,000 hours, literally one-on-one, desk side with some of the busiest and brightest people you'd ever meet,
Hmm.
actually walking them through this process and refining it. And that became essentially the core elements of both a coaching process and a training process
Hmm.
that became the essence of them. It wasn't GTD was a shorthand for the book titled Getting Things Done, which was published in 2001. But I started
Hmm.
this in the mid 80s. So Getting Things Done was really just a manual I wrote. I just got good coaching, said, David, look, it took me that long to figure out that what I'd figured out, nobody else seemed to have figured out, and that it was unique. It was bulletproof. You couldn't punch a
Hmm.
hole in it. Anybody
Hmm.
who implemented any of these practices improved their condition, period.
Hmm.
Couldn't find an exception to that anywhere. And this got tested in some of the most challenging organizations. I won't mention them by name, but if their immune system would spit you out in about 2 seconds if you couldn't stand toe to toe with the best and brightest, making
Yeah.
about 10 times more money in a year than I'd make in my life. And my stuff went viral inside of that culture. And I went, if it worked there, I doubt if anybody can punch a hole in it. So
Yeah.
that then gave me the confidence to write the book. I didn't go out and just write the book, try to write a book. I just said, in case I get run over by a bus, I think I should probably write the manual. I got some good coaching about that. So that's what
Yeah.
I then did. It took me 4 years. It started in 1997, and it got published, the first edition anyway, in 2001. And then that just changed the chapter of my life because I
Hmm.
had no idea how popular it was going to be, but I just needed to get the manual out there,
Yeah.
and in case I
It
got
was a
run over by a
huge
bus.
success. I mean, to this day, so we sold millions of copies, translated into 30 languages, training in 90 countries. I was thinking before this talk back because I read it, I think, my early 20s. So it's around the time that it came out. And I realized I can't separate myself from GTD looking back. I can't know, it's impossible to know what my life would be without GTD because I always had it as a tool from my very first job. And and I was always able to be super productive in a reliable way and enjoy it. And so it's really impossible for me to think of what it would be like if I was stressed out, disorganized. I don't know, maybe, so the whole career, it's impossible to tell. But so we still probably have people, even though everyone I talk to about you doing the interview, everybody's very excited, but there's still people who are not familiar with GTD. And I know this is probably super boring for you, having being who you are and having lived your whole life with this. Can you give us a short summary to get people oriented who don't know what GTD is?
Sure. First of all, your head's a crappy office, and most people are trying to use their head to remember, remind, prioritize, and manage relationships between a whole lot of commitments they've got about life and work.
Hmm.
Some of the foundation of this is externalizing all that stuff, getting it out of your head. And it's a pretty simple process. You take anything that got your attention that you might need to decide or do something about, and you capture it, you externalize it, you write it down, record it, put it somewhere, get it out of your head. And
Hmm.
then sooner than later, you clarify, you decide, what am I going to do about that, if anything? And if there's a next action on it, what is that? And if one action won't finish, what's the project? That's the clarification process about the things you capture that you've collected. And then you
Hmm.
need to organize reminders of that. Gee, I need to go buy this at the store. That goes in, then an errands list. I need to talk to my life partner about this. That goes into a list of stuff to talk to him or her about.
Hmm.
This is a website I need to serve, goes to some sort of list about websites you want to serve. So then you organize those reminders in some external place. That then step 4, once you've captured, clarified, and organized, then step 4 is you make sure you look at what you've organized, all these lists at some appropriate
Hmm.
time. You look at your calendar to know where you need to be. You look at your errands list when you're going out for errands. You look at your stuff to things you need to talk to your boss or your wife or your husband about, before you do that, so that you feel comfortable about what you're doing. And then step 5 is then you engage. Then you decide to take an action or put your attention on something that seems to be appropriate given the context of all of that stuff you've got.
Hmm.
So in a sense, that's it. So I'll apologize right now. I'm not going to say anything more or less than what I just said. I can
Yeah.
expand on that as much as you want, but that's it. And I didn't make that up, guys. I just recognize what you do if you want to get control of your life.
Hmm. Yeah, you mentioned that really just observing the natural way we plan and manage projects when it does work, who informed you when you did this. Can you maybe speak a little
Yeah.
bit about how is this the
Yeah.
natural way?
The first thing I decided, described, which is the 5 stages of how you get things under control, which is I
Hmm.
capture, I clarify, organize, reflect, and engage. That's how you manage that sort of 24 hours of your day where you have to manage 1,000 things. The dog needs taken out. I need to call this person. I just got this email. This wow. What do I need to do about that? So your day is full of all kinds of stuff. So
Hmm.
that process of capturing, clarifying, organizing, reflecting, and engaging is how you get control and stable in any kind of a situation. But then you
Hmm.
say, yeah, but now I've got this project. How do I think about that appropriately? Or
Hmm.
now I've got this thing. Should we adopt, or should we get divorced, or should we hire a vice president of marketing, or whatever? How do I think through that? Assuming I could hold the rest of the world back, how do I now think through that? So planning, if you will, or project planning, if you will. And then early on in my consulting career, I said, God, there's got to be some best model about how do we plan stuff, and I couldn't find any. Couldn't find anybody
Hmm.
who found a good project planning. There were a lot of software out there that kind of pretended to do that, and a lot of things. And by that time, I had a lot of people in the corporate training world. And I said, have you found a good project planning seminar? No, no.
Seems pretty
Uh,
basic. Yeah.
and so I started to think about it. And I don't know whether it took me hours, days, or weeks, Aaron, to come up with this, but I said, wait a minute. I think we're planning all the time. We planned how to get dressed, what to eat dinner,
Mm.
whatever. And I started to just deconstruct that or re-engineer that, reverse engineer it and say, how did I get dressed? Or how did I decide to do that? And so I discovered there is a natural planning process we go through. We're doing it all the time. You
Mm.
have some intention. I want to be out of the room. That's a purpose. And I don't want to fall over or break anything. That's a principle. And my vision is being out of the room successfully. And then I go, okay, what do I need to do to get out of the room? I need to get out of my chair. I need to walk around here and whatever I need to. So you then got it organized. Then what'd you do? Then you said, okay, my next step, get out of the chair. Next action. So this whole idea of purpose, vision, brainstorm, uh, organize, and next action is something we're doing all the time naturally.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
didn't make that up. I just recognized it. You can't stop doing that. That's how you walk. That's how you talk. That's why you're talking to me right now. It's what you're going to do with this conversation once we get off air.
For sure.
Right? You've got a purpose. You're going to have some vision of success and what you'd like it to ultimately be. You're going to brainstorm what are all the things that might need to be relevant to make this thing work and whatever. And then you're going to organize that into something. Okay, here's the 3 things we need to make sure happens. And here's the next thing I need to do. So you can't stop doing this. I just recognize that. The weird thing is the natural model is not the normal model about how people plan.
Yeah.
Right? How'd you plan your wedding if you got married? Did you do that by what's the purpose of a wedding? And what are the principles we want to hold when we do this thing? What's our vision of wild success of this wedding being really successful? What are all the
Yeah.
things we need to take into consideration about this to make sure that we get to that kind of wild success? Great. How are we going to organize this? And gee, dear, what's the next step on the moving parts? And most people did some version of that, indeed, but probably not with the rigor that would have made it probably less stressful than it probably was.
Yeah. And there's a good argument. I'm not sure if I heard you say this, but I heard someone say our brains weren't designed to deal with that amount of information and incoming projects and that level. There were lots of things to do, like hunt, but they're more linear and more, okay, I'm hungry now, or you need to get food. But now we have so many things. The wedding is just one out of hundreds potentially of projects. So you needed to be more explicit and more codified. So one thing that I hear from anyone that I talk to about GTD, and especially my designer friends, is it's a really well-designed system. And which means so as designers, what do we mean by that? Because we're product designers, we're not graphic designers. We don't just make things pretty. We think about how things should be put together. And there are these principles in design thinking. You start with empathy, right? So you're actually working with people and experiencing what they were experiencing and understanding their situation. So do you have anything to say about starting with that ground level and then the iterative process over that, making it wasn't born complete and perfect. It's a process of iteration. That's also something that designers talk about. So I would love to hear something about the actual design process.
It's a good question. And I've never really thought about it that specifically, other than I remember one afternoon back when I was still living in California, trying to create the chart. What is the thinking process that needs to happen to appropriately engage with something?
Hmm.
So it's really about how do you deal with what are the decisions you need to make and the structures you need to have in place and the behaviors you need to engage in to make sure that email is off your mind or that piece of paper is off your mind or that thought is off your mind. It was merely more about the end. And even now, when I coach people, they say, David, should I have 14 lists? Should I have this here? Should I use this software? I said, you need to do whatever you need to do to make sure that nothing is on your mind when you're cooking spaghetti except spaghetti. What do you need to do about that project to get that project off your mind? Because there's an inverse relationship between on your mind and getting done. The only reason it's going to be on your mind is because there's some decision you haven't made or some result you haven't parked somewhere in a place you trust.
Yeah.
That's the only reason. Unless you just like thinking about that, which is fine. But if something is not necessarily bugging you, but, oh, gee, we need cat food, or what should we do this? Or, yeah, but I'm thinking about that. Yeah. So the only reason that's going to still pop into your mind is because you haven't decided what's the final outcome I'm after. And then what's the next step that we need to take, to essentially be in the driver's seat about improving it or clarifying it or resolving it.
Yeah.
And then parking that somewhere that you trust, like on your calendar or on a list that you'll see at the right time, or the right person will see at the right time. And so I just figured out what was the end result and then reverse engineer. Okay, in order to get there, how do you need to get that off your mind? Well, first thing you have to do is recognize what's on your mind. So that was step one. That's why the capture process showed up. So it was really just an engineering process, essentially. How do you take anything out there that's got your attention and get your mind off of it? And I just thought that through and worked that through, and then found out that those were very real behaviors people could engage in that you're not born doing. If you learn the process and you set up the process, then it happens. Like to your point, you can't even remember when you didn't do this.
Yeah. It's interesting. As a designer, I know that feeling of once you cracked something, it just works, and then you run with it. And it's because you got to the principle at the core of the thing that now it just seems to work for everybody. But until you get to that point, there's a lot of trial and error and the things that sort of works, things that the reality gives you feedback on how well you're doing. And so I guess it happened so long ago. I guess if I could talk to you the day where it finally stabilized, what you would tell me about the previous couple of years in terms of what are the experiments you tried? What are some, and
none of them were really experiments. Everything worked that I used with people. Just to get them to make a list of things that had their attention. That's going to work. Everybody's going to feel better about that, at least a little bit. If they just sat down and wrote down the 10 things that have their attention, get it out of their head, that's going to feel better. So it wasn't that things were broken that we needed to fix or course correct. It was just incomplete.
Yeah.
Meaning complete being, wow, if you really did this, if you got all the horizons of your commitments clear in terms of what they might be consciously, as conscious as you could be about them, and make sure that those all lined up, and that was a complete inventory, and you had some review and reflection process that kept that whole thing current, you've got the master key for the rest of your life. But I couldn't have told you that when I was only 3 or 4 or 5 years into the process. But each one of those things was an improvement. It just wasn't complete, if you will.
Yeah.
So at a certain, and when I say complete, they all had their own standalone value, but the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I'm always of two minds. One mind says, if you're not willing to keep everything out of your head, don't keep anything out of your head. It either your head's a place to hold stuff or it's not. Right.
Yeah.
And if you still got stuff in your head, don't bother with trying to keep any kind of a system, because you won't trust either one. You're not going to trust your head. You're not going to trust your system. Forget it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. You'd have a hard time intellectually justifying halfway in between. Either your head's a place to hold it or it's not.
It's funny. You're describing my life. I move between total GTD commitment and then periods where I'm like, I'm just writing the book now. I'm just doing X. I have no projects. I'm refusing responsibility to anything except for this one thing. And those are fun times too. And then, of course, you suffer the consequences when it's over because you did neglect the rest of your life. But very binary. It's like I'm either all in or I'm
that's why
not.
I say that I'm of two minds. I could tell you that, which is in a sense a truth. But also another truth is just keep a pencil and paper by your bed and you'll sleep better.
Yeah.
I've
always done. Yeah.
None of these practices of GTD are like running with scissors. There's nothing dangerous with any of these things. In fact, they're going to improve anything you do. Anything you do, anything you externalize, whether it's thinking, design, or whatever. Any of you designers, you guys know you need a whiteboard, you need something, I just got the Remarkable, which is actually a pretty cool tool.
Oh, I have one here. It's my favorite. You got the 2 or the 1? I have the 1.
I got the 2. So the pen sticks to it, and it also has this time stuff where you can create a whiteboard that you can also see on your laptop. As well.
I have that too. Do you have the eraser on the other side? You can flip the pen and I'm so jealous.
But it doesn't work nearly as well as the little. Let me erase this section.
Yeah.
It doesn't erase it as clean, but
That's right.
that elegant little piece of hardware. Yeah,
I
but
love it.
it's coming close because paper is better than digital. For the most part, the paper-based system, I kept a paper-based planner, the Time Designer Time System out of Denmark for 20 years plus. There was no better system to manage your life because, frankly, it's easier to see the gestalt of everything when you could then see them that way. Try to do that on a computer, you can't even come close. Nothing can come as close to that. Not only that, if you have a lot of ADD or ADHD-esque kind of people, they don't have the patience to click more than once. And so if you're trying to click onto your phone twice in order to get to some list to be able to add to that list, you're not going to do it. You're too busy. That's going to slow you down too much, put you in quicksand. And so some of those people have gone back to paper planners because paper and pen is just so fast. It's so in your face, so much easier to see a context of stuff. Of course, it has its downside. You can't then connect and can't whatever. So the new world will be where the feel of paper and the ability of paper instantly to be available to you to do designing, to do thinking or whatever, and then to be able to instantly digitalize it, send a PDF to your designer, which is one of the things I just did. I've been using this. Catherine and I just bought an apartment, so designing our own stuff. I created a notebook just called Design and started to craft out, for instance, here's my thoughts of the TV wall that we're going to have.
I love it.
So I was able to do this just with this pen, and I can erase it whatever. And I just sent that to my designer. I sent that to our contractor or whatever, because they're going to need to know where to put electric plugs on this thing.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. We do design sprints. So I often sketch on it and just upload it to the board. And it's a remarkable product. And there's ways to hack templates into it. So you can create your own notebook template. And so I was thinking about GTD. I was thinking about different things that you could do with it. So that's a nice surprise that you have it. I'm a big evangelist, and I'm trying to get also the CEO of Remarkable on the podcast, because I think you would have a lot of interesting things to say.
I'm not sure that it's not yet as ubiquitously available to make a reminder for to-do lists and things like that. So you can't, right now we're migrating to Office 365 and to be able to then see all those lists there and to be able to then move emails to that really quick and so forth. You're not going to be able to do that. But again, the ancillary stuff that you can do to be able to then make visual your thinking, or even just journal writing. If you like writing journals, I love journal writing. I did for years. And I do that off and on, but a good fountain pen and a really cool journal. It's just nothing like that. But I thought I would experiment with Remarkable to see how well. So I have a notebook called Journal in there, which I'm just experimenting to see. Because when you put the calligraphy pen on, it just becomes very cool.
Nice. I have a journal. I have like a strategy notebook just to think about strategy. It's really, it replaced paper for me. I used to always carry a pad of paper. Now I don't. I only use it. But it was great until the first time I forgot to charge it. And then I was like, my paper is out of battery. Nice.
Still can't beat this.
Yeah, that's very convenient.
For
small
35 years.
Writing pad.
Because this goes everywhere, and you're not going to be able to until they can digitalize this. But even that, who cares? It's actually easier to write than it is to boot something up.
Yeah.
And because that's not these little notes, these two little notes I made this morning, those are not things that I need as a reminder. I need to decide what to do about those things.
Right.
So those are so in the capture step, still 98% of my capture is still low tech because it's just faster. No Wi-Fi, no batteries required. Nothing runs out of battery.
Interesting. Yeah, that's true. I'm so dependent on these devices. I've been using OmniFocus for years. It's not perfect,
Ken's a smart guy. He took a seminar of mine and gave the inspiration to do all that.
Yeah, it was clearly designed for GTD. So I wanted to talk about the spiritual aspect of GTD. You say that it's not spiritual in itself, and I think that's right. But I think it has some really deep spiritual implications. So even the phrase "mind like water," and your previous statement about liking freedom, being a freedom guy, to me is a spiritual value. Now, I'm just recently finished my master's in religious studies, and I'm wrote my thesis on Buddhist philosophy, and am also really interested in Taoism and some of the other Oriental philosophies. And some of the stuff really resonates with concepts from Taoism, like Wu Wei. Or where do you connect with the free mind aspect? And I'd love to hear again. You mentioned, I think you said Jeff Rogers,
John Rogers.
John Rogers. Sorry, and yeah, how does that connect to you with GTD? Where I understand that it's not
Well,
necessarily for everyone.
GTD, showed up just because I needed a good job. So it had nothing to do with getting God, truth, in the universe. It turned out that what I uncovered in the process of uncovering this model was that it had a deep resonance with what, at least I interpret a lot of our work here is as a material being, and that is to complete and to create. That those are two things. I don't care who you are, how old you are, what you're aware of. You will be held accountable for what you've created. That is what, and complete open loops that you've created. You can call it karma. You're going to pay 3,000 lifetimes later. You're going to have to meet the person that you killed, and they're going to kill you. I don't know. There's a lot of that stuff you could surmise about anyway. But just to tell yourself, I need cat food, and you don't handle getting cat food, the cat's going to scratch your face. So you're gonna get results of the things that you've put into motion, the things you've committed to. See, the world is fine. By the way, look outside. It's not overwhelmed. It's not confused. Yeah. It's doing just fine. Right. Yeah. It's only how we engage with that world that the issue is. But a lot of our engagements have a lot to do with what are you here to complete? What do you need to finish up? And whether you like it or not, you will eat it if you put it in motion. Now, whether it's good food or bad food, that depends on what you put into motion. The universe and the powers that be don't really care in a way. They care that you learn from what you did. And so that's a lot of what our experience is about is what have I created? How do I handle that? How do I close it up? Or how do I just renegotiate it and give it up and stop the engagement with it? And then, okay, so that gets you clear. So creating or completing things gets you clear. But then what do you do with your clarity? I got early on that these two things, which we need to complete and we need to then create, and you need to be responsible and accountable to yourself. Yeah, and many times other people, but they're all with yourself about what have I put in motion? How do I manage that? How do I make sure I handle that as elegantly as possible? And then what do I then keep putting in motion? Because you can't stop creating. So you're maybe even not then, but as soon as you focus on something, you're creating. As soon as you put your attention on something, you're putting energy into it.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're trying to be, I want to think about nothing. Yeah, but that's what you're going to be thinking about. Just thinking about nothing. I'm going to do nothing. Yes, but that's what you're doing. Nothing. Right. Yep. So you can't stop being a teleological, thinking, focused, creative being. You can't stop being creative. You created exactly what you're getting. You're creating constantly. So I kind of caught that, what this little methodology got a hold of was managing what you've put into motion in terms of the things that are incomplete, and then managing how do I focus now once I am clear, or what do I want to keep focusing on and keep creating, and those two things. And so in a way, yeah, the essence of GTD is spiritual in a very small s, in the sense of that's what we're all about. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't whatever, but it's a very real thing. And if you get control of if you experience completion and experience positive creation, you're going to feel transformed. Not anything I did, but you just lined yourself up to more of who you really are. So, spiritual really kind of like, well, who are you?
Yeah.
A lot of people looking out there for whatever they think spiritual is, whereas spiritual may just be what's in here. Who's thinking that? Who even asked that question? And that would be the Zen aspect of what you're talking about. A lot of what my studies have been are probably lined up more closely with the esoteric Sufis. So if you read Rumi or any of those, the Sufi line, not the mundane line of the Sufism, but the esoteric, side of that is very close. And I've always resonated very much with the Zen. I read all of Alan Watts and Suzuki by the time I finished high school. So I always loved that sort of Zen minimalist, a sacred irreverence. It's a favorite phrase of mine. It's called, don't take anything too seriously. Jeez.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to get at. So with the Wu Wei, so Zen is deeply influenced by Taoist thought and Taoism. There's this concept of Wu Wei, of action through non-action. And I could read you some things from the Tao Te Ching, but essentially there's activity. You're always doing something, but you're not really identified with it. And you're not really hanging on for it has to happen this way. You're holding it lightly. And so for instance,
yeah. But you can get the chick sent me high. You can get the flow.
Yeah, the flow.
When you're in flow, it's a paradox of you're detached but totally engaged.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think some of the misunderstood magic of GTD is it's not all about doing tasks. It's almost about, so I recently added the project to my GTD, be utterly useless. And just as a reminder for myself to sometimes stop trying to be useful all the time, because it depletes you. So take time to be utterly useless. And then I will put things on there that are completely useless to everyone else, but that are meaningful to me. And so I think, isn't that part of the intention?
The intention is to be clear.
Yeah.
That's it. What do you need to do? Sometimes you need to be useless to be clear. And I think sometimes that's the serendipity of life is often where the coolest things show up. Especially designers. Come on, you guys. You thought you were trying to design something. You came up with something else. I'll bet Steve Jobs had a lot of those experiences.
For sure.
Where he started to do something and went, oh, wait a minute. Geez, look at this.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So sometimes no agenda is a really good agenda to have, for sure. Yeah, and it's a very misunderstood thing because people look at that, they read the book or they see all this and they go, oh my God, that's so structured, that's so engineered, that's so overly structured. Then they meet me or they meet our team or whatever, and they go, God, you're nothing like what we thought you'd be. They thought you'd be,
right.
You'd be a type A, buttoned down, tight ass.
You're not making me feel guilty for not closing more tasks.
But see, I love that whole idea of spontaneity and being open to the serendipity of the universe. To me, is where a lot of the cool stuff shows up. That's why I came up with GTD and why it's so powerful. It gives me the ability to do that and stay that way, as opposed to having things back up on me. I know a lot of people that say, oh, let me just get rid of all of that and I can just be free and spontaneous. Yeah, for a little while. And then that tiger is going to come around and beat you and bite you in the butt because of the things you did not handle that you were still engaged in. So the way out is through. So,
I like that.
They say, well, I got too many things on my list. I go, don't get mad at me for your list. That ain't my list.
I didn't create your list.
Exactly. That's your list.
Exactly.
You decide what do you want to do with that list. Throw it all away. Fine. I don't care. If that's what you need to do to get a clear mind, go for it. But good luck.
You wrote something that I thought was really beautiful and Ready for Anything. You can only
By the way, that's my Ready for Anything is my favorite book. And I find anybody who gets Ready for Anything, I go, this person really gets GTD.
Yeah, Ready for Anything. I think I read it a couple years after it came out, but still pretty early. And it's almost like a more philosophical, lots of little nuggets of wisdom. And this is one of my favorite things. You said you can only feel good about what you're not doing when you know what you're not doing. And I definitely find that again and again with my GTD, when it's up to date, when everything is running smoothly, I can choose not to do anything that's on the list and go watch a movie because I know what I'm not doing. And so that freedom is something that you don't have if you're living in complete mess.
By the way, you would probably appreciate this. For about 2 or 3 years in my life, when I was going through a very serious time in the late 60s, early 70s, I pretty much lived every day by throwing the I Ching. Every morning, or whenever I had a problem or an issue, I would throw the coins and read the I Ching. So I don't know if you noticed that Ready for Anything was written somewhat in the same format as the I Ching. That is, there's a principle, there's a basic thought, and then there's a commentary.
Interesting. Interesting. No, I'm not super familiar with the I Ching, but I'll check it out. It sounds interesting now.
Jung championed the I Ching for the West. was basically that whole idea of synchronicity in the world, that somehow everything seems to be energy-wise connected. So
Mm,
you could get something, physical that would give you something that represented something that was going on in a more universal or internal or spiritual way, small s.
interesting. And Jung is definitely also a really interesting thinker. Yeah, look into that. I'm less familiar with that, but there's definitely some of the statements like "be like water," or that also exists very deeply in the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the founding books of many traditions. But there's in the Tao Te Ching, there's a chapter where they say, plan for what is difficult while it is easy. Work at what is great while it is small. The difficult undertakings in the world all start with what is easy. The great undertakings in the world all begin with what is small. This is why sages never work at great things and are able to achieve greatness. And this resonated with me with the GTD model. You almost never think of the entire project. You only think about the next action. And the next action is always something small and easy in most cases. And then you think about the next action, but it's always starting very small and doing the small things, and the big things happen
Yeah.
in themselves.
Well, I came up with a saying many years ago called "Small things done in strategic places create powerful results."
Yeah.
But it's the small things that do that. They just need to be this small things done strategically. And by the way, that also works negatively. You do little things in negatively important ways produces big negative results.
Yeah.
So any one of those just gets magnified, but it always starts with small stuff. And
Yeah.
whoever said it was great because, hey, don't sweat the small stuff. It's all small stuff.
It's all small stuff. And he also talked about the quiet voices inside of us that we have to be clear to hear. We have to have clarity and space to be able to actually respond to these small voices.
That makes it
Um,
easier. It
yeah.
makes it easier. Yeah, for sure.
So this is a question from a friend of mine who's also a designer, and he loves your work. And he asked, does David Allen ever have bad days, non-productive days? Like, is he like a superhero Teflon guy, or like is he a human being like the rest of us?
That's a good question. I'd say my life is constantly off base. I'm constantly feeling out of control and unfocused. I know how to pull myself back,
Hmm.
but it's what you consider a bad day. There are no bad days. They're just days. And some days I feel better, and some days I get more done than otherwise. And at the end of the day, is this the best day I could have spent, given my energy, given what was going on, given what happened. And
Hmm.
come on, I'm 75, Aaron. I've been a lot of miles on these tires. At this point, you don't have a lot of I don't have a lot of energy to think about that was a bad day. That was just the day. Yeah, and there's certain things that go on that I don't like. Meaning, gee, it would be nice if I didn't have this issue that just showed up. Now I'm going to have to deal with some sort of ugly email I'm going to have to write, or some hard decision I'm going to have to make with people that I love. And it's not going to be very popular. So
Hmm.
those things happen. You don't get rid of those. I don't think you'll ever get rid of the challenges and things like that. Sort of challenge us to step up to the plate. And yeah, so I'm not always in some sartorial
Yeah.
being state. So I'm
I,
engaged. I'm just down in the trenches and dealing with life as well as anybody, as
yeah.
much as anybody is. I just have a lot of techniques that allow me to still stay on top of my game and not feel too much of a victim about all
Yeah.
that. And I still am pretty lazy. Sometimes I don't implement my own stuff, but I know I could. So it's a strange thing. The better you get at GTD, I don't know if you're at that point, Aaron, is the more crazy you let yourself get, because you can clean it up whenever you need to.
I
All
am
right.
definitely at that point. I've been at that point for 10 years. Not
Yeah.
sure I know how to get out of that point, but
You'll get
great,
better.
great. So I have two more questions. One is about integration of GTD with some of the other popular systems, or not even popular systems, but so you mentioned Scrum and Kanban. I noticed that in my life, there's a lot of pipelines, right? There's the pipeline of podcast episodes that need to be produced and they go through the steps. There's customers in my CRM that are a pipeline of leads turns into meetings, videos, blog posts, workshops, events. All of these things have multiple pipelines, and I'm not sure how to integrate it into my GTD, except to say something like check the pipeline, and it feels like there maybe could be more there. So I'd love to hear your take on that.
I don't really have one, Aaron, other than I deal with the same thing. There's nothing has been automated in terms of AI yet that could really sort and curate everything appropriately that you
Yeah.
need to see, so that you wake up and you turn on your dashboard and you see exactly which of the pipelines you want to see where and where on the pipeline you are, so that in 30 seconds you get a glance of the whole gestalt of how to approach your life and day.
Yeah.
We ain't there. We ain't there yet. The software is not there yet. You still have to internalize. It still has to be labor intensive cognitively for you to figure out what you need to see. When should you check? I think I've got 20,000 LinkedIn. If anybody wants to be LinkedIn connection, I say sure. And so, and a lot of people communicate now through LinkedIn, and I don't check that and haven't checked that regularly. And now I've been getting some important things that kind of have shown up through that channel and whatever. So now about every Sunday or on the weekend, I say, okay, let me clean up all my LinkedIn connections and requests and messages that I have. So I've had to then curate that and say, okay, here's how I now manage that channel, that pipeline, as you said. Yeah. So you just have to there's no tool that's going to help you with that other than your brain. Yeah. I'm sorry, Aaron, don't knock me down for saying this, but you're going to have to think.
Oh, I hate that. But I'll take it. But
I'm so sorry. I'm so ingredient to make this stuff work. But thinking about what? And thinking within the regular context. See, everybody's thinking. You can't stop thinking. But what are you thinking about? Yeah. It doesn't take discipline. It takes focus.
Yeah.
I don't like the word discipline. Discipline just means hard work, sweat. I like direction. How do you direct your thinking about that email? How do you direct your thinking about that pipeline? How do you direct your thinking about what's in there and what you're going to do with it? See, to me, social media pretty much is just a cocktail party. I just wander in and out, do Instagram, do LinkedIn, do Facebook or whatever, just as I feel like it. Or somebody may give me a link or something. They say, hey, you got to go see this. And that's fine. It's like a cocktail party, meaning I just wander in and out. I have no really other commitment than that. However, if you're leaving your work or you need to manage your social media network for your next job and your next gig, absolutely, it'll have a different importance to you and a different recursion of frequency and engagement that you would need to make. That's why you can't make any, I would never make any templated suggestion about any of that. Now, what do you need to do to get Facebook off your mind? What do you need to do to get Instagram off your mind? What do you need to do to get social media off your mind? That's it.
Yeah.
And if it's okay, I just need to make sure that I see that every so often. Then you build in some trigger. If you don't have the habit anyway, then that's off your mind. Doesn't mean it's done. It just means I don't have to think about that anymore. You probably don't need to organize when you need to take a piss. It just happens. And then I handle it when it shows up. Right.
Yep.
There's a lot of stuff in life I don't need to organize or remind myself about because life will remind me appropriately.
Yeah. That makes sense. One closing question that I usually ask, that because you're such a big public speaker, I'm thinking maybe we take it a little bit in a different direction, but I'll introduce the question. So the question is, Alain de Botton in his TED Talk describes the difference between a lecture and a sermon. A lecture being a way to give a little bit of information, and a sermon is there to change your life. And so the question goes, what is a short sermon that you would give someone starting out in life? What is one thing that if you could really convince someone to do would really change their life? And because your message is so clear, I want to challenge you and say this is someone who is already implementing the basics of GTD, already is not someone where you say, write it all down. This someone who's already familiar with that. What's a deep lesson that you could give someone like that?
learn to relax and listen to the still small voice inside of you that has your direction and is your coach.
All right. Thank you very much. And so, where can people find you, find more about your services, get involved with GTD?
If you go to our website, gettingthingsdone.com, and you click on training and coaching, you'll see where we have certified trainers and coaches all around the world. And so you can click on that, type in your country, wherever you are, and you'll see people that we have certified. This is not mail order certification. This is like real rigorous people. It's a great network of folks who really get this, very much in alignment, shoulder to shoulder with me about this work. And that's, pretty much how you can get access to it. Obviously, my books, they're available out there in lots of languages, so you can get it there. The website, we also have a free newsletter you can sign up for, that give you podcasts. We have a paid sort of membership program, GTD Connect, that has a really deep library of stuff and interviews for years that we've done, and just terabytes of digital and video and audio information out there. If you really want to do a deep dive and get involved in all the different aspects of what this looks, sounds, and feel like. So those are all ways to play. Another quick one is, I just discovered myself, there's a YouTube channel for GTD and me that has recorded all kinds of long form interviews, like with Tim Ferriss and with what's his name at London Real, and as well as my TED Talks and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can get a quick aha with me talking about this stuff in the same level of depth that you've been poking at me with, Aaron.
Cool. And I strongly recommend, if you don't know GTD, if you don't know David's work, check it out. It will change your life. It will change your career. And it will enable you to better listen to that small voice inside. So thank you, David. I really appreciate your time today.
Aaron, this was fun. Thanks. Great interview.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.